We think we have a pretty good handle on the story of colonialism, these heroic uprisings against foreign rulers. But what if a huge chapter of that story, the revolts in 19th century Bengal, has been misunderstood this whole time? Today, we're digging into a source that challenges pretty much everything we thought we knew.
The source material we're looking at today kicks things off with a real bombshell of a question. What if these weren't really anti-British revolts at all? What if the British were just a sideshow in a completely different kind of conflict? Seriously, this one question could reframe an entire era of history. Okay, so before we dive into the really controversial stuff, let's just hit the rewind button for a second. Let's talk about the story that most of us probably learned in school, the standard textbook version of what happened.
And that story, you know the one, it usually goes something like this. You've got these brave local leaders rising up, fighting back against the oppressive British Empire. They're painted as these early sparks of a long and noble fight for independence.
And then you have guys like Titu Mir, right? He's practically the poster boy for this narrative. We remember him as a freedom fighter, a martyr, who stood up and defiantly resisted the British. That's the story we've all been told.
But here's where it gets really complicated. Our source material argues that when you actually dig into the records from that time, that familiar story starts to crack, and it raises some very unsettling questions.
And these questions get right to the heart of the whole contradiction. The source is basically asking, hold on a minute, if these were anti-British revolts, why were Hindu villages the main ones getting torched? Why attack temples, but leave British military bases completely alone? And why do local records talk about pure devastation, while our history books talk about heroic reform? The official story, it just doesn't seem to add up.
So to really build its case, the source zooms in on two major examples: the uprising led by our man Titu Mir, and another one called the Faraizi movement.
And this is where the two versions of history just collide, head-on. On one side, you've got the textbook Titu Mir, the anti-British freedom fighter. But the source material? It paints a totally different picture. It calls his movement the Barasat Jihaad and argues its main targets weren't the British at all, but local Hindu landlords and peasants. That's a completely different motivation.
And it's pretty much the same deal with the Faraizi movement. Textbooks often describe it as this peaceful Islamic reform movement for social uplift, but the source argues it was often coercive and that it directly attacked Hindu religious practices and festivals. Again, the conflict seems to be happening within the local population, not aimed at the British.
This brings us to a really crucial piece of evidence that just flips the entire script. According to 19th century records cited in the source, the British weren't actually the main targets. Instead, they often had to step in to stop communal violence. Why? Mostly because it was bad for business, and it made it a whole lot harder to govern and collect revenue. Their main goal wasn't fighting some grand freedom struggle, it was just trying to maintain order.
So if these weren't anti-colonial uprisings, what in the world were they? Well, the source offers a very different conclusion, and it all comes down to one powerful word: atavism. So what exactly is atavism? It sounds a little academic, but the idea, in this context, is pretty straightforward. The source defines it as an ideological step backward, a desire to turn back the clock and bring back a form of religious dominance from an earlier time. It's about reviving the past, not building a new, independent future. And this all leads right to the source's central claim. These movements were never truly about fighting the British. In fact, in this view, the British were almost irrelevant. They were just sort of incidental to the real goal. So, who was the target? According to this document, the main target was Hindu society, its people, its institutions, and its religious practices. Now that completely reframes the entire conflict. It shifts it away from a political anti-colonial struggle to something far more internal and, well, religiously driven.
But look, you might be wondering, does this distinction really matter? Well, according to the source, changing how we see these events isn't just some academic debate, it's about actually correcting the historical record itself.
The source argues this is a huge deal for three main reasons. First, it restores a sense of accountability by identifying the real nature of the violence. Second, it accurately reframes who the victims were, people whose suffering was often just erased and hidden behind that freedom struggle label. And finally, it forces us to challenge those simple, comfortable stories we tell ourselves, and instead face a much more complex and maybe more disturbing truth.
And so we end up right back where we started. The source material we've gone through today really forces us to ask a pretty profound question. When we change the why behind an event, are we just adding a little footnote to the story, or are we actually rewriting history itself?